The year was set. The season was chosen with care. Nothing in this campaign was accidental. For years, the land of Hellas had carried the memory of a narrow pass where men did not retreat. That memory was not spoken loudly. It was preserved in records, in oaths, in silences shared by institutions that understood endurance as a form of power. The loss at Thermopylae had not weakened Sparta. It had reorganized it. Sparta did not mourn as other cities mourned. It archived. Every fallen name was placed within a system older than any living commander. The agoge taught obedience, but it also taught patience. Retaliation without order was chaos. Chaos was weakness. Sparta waited. By the time the Persian presence in Greece began to stretch thin, the decision had already been made. Not in the open assemblies of allies, but within Spartan discipline itself. The loss of the 300 was not an emotional wound. It was a strategic imbalance, and imbalances in Spartan doctrine demanded correction. The field of Plataea was selected not for glory but for control, wide enough to deploy formation, close enough to supply routes, distant from the sea where Persian numbers meant little without coordination. The terrain was studied in the same way laws were studied, slowly, repeatedly, without sentiment. This would not be a spectacle, it would be a settlement. 10,000 Spartans did not march as individuals. They moved as a unit designed to erase variables, each shield aligned with the next, each step regulated. This was not revenge fueled by anger. It was retaliation executed by procedure. Opposite them stood a force that believed dominance came from scale. Persia had ruled through presence, armies vast enough to discourage resistance before battle began. But Plataea was not a city to intimidate. It was a space where intimidation dissolved into logistics, discipline, and time. The Persian command understood this too late. Weeks passed without decisive engagement. To an untrained observer, it appeared indecision ruled both camps. In reality, the waiting was the battle. Water access was tested. Supply lines were strained. Messages were intercepted or delayed. Spartan commanders allowed uncertainty to do what blades could not: degrade coherence. The Greek alliance watched Sparta carefully. Athens contributed numbers. Other city-states offered contingents, but authority did not disperse. Sparta remained the institutional center of gravity. Orders were brief. Explanations were unnecessary. The system assumed compliance, and compliance was delivered. What distinguished Sparta at Plataea was not aggression, but restraint. No premature charges. No attempts to impress allies. Each maneuver was designed to reduce the Persian army's ability to function as a unified body. Morale, often celebrated in poetry, was treated here as a measurable resource. When morale declined, mistakes followed. Sparta waited for mistakes. They came quietly. Persian cavalry harassment achieved little. Terrain limited maneuver. Greek hoplites held formation. When supply routes faltered, internal pressure began to mount within the Persian ranks. Different contingents followed different customs, answered to different officers. The longer they waited, the more visible those fractures became. Sparta did not exploit weakness immediately. Instead, they documented it. Commanders observed how orders traveled, which units hesitated, which responded late. Knowledge accumulated like weight. The moment would arrive when weight tipped into collapse. Until then, restraint remained policy. This was the institutional difference. Persia fought to demonstrate authority. Sparta fought to eliminate it. When engagement finally began, it was not announced. There was no signal meant for history. Formations advanced with the same measured pace used in training. Shields met resistance. Lines held. What mattered was not speed, but inevitability. Spartan discipline compressed the battlefield. Persian forces found themselves unable to reposition effectively. Orders conflicted. Command structures overlapped. The advantage of numbers became a liability when space and timing were restricted. Sparta advanced not to overwhelm, but to isolate. Each isolated unit lost protection. Each loss weakened the whole. There was no celebration. No pursuit driven by rage. Spartan soldiers did not shout names of fallen heroes. They moved forward because the system required it. The memory of the 300 was present, but it did not dictate action. It justified it. Allies later described the battle as decisive. Sparta did not. In Spartan records, Plataea was not framed as victory. It was framed as resolution, an imbalance corrected, an obligation fulfilled. The fallen at Thermopylae had not been avenged through spectacle but through finality. Yet even as the Persian position collapsed, something remained unresolved: the cost. Sparta had demonstrated that institutional discipline could outlast empire. But in doing so, it reinforced a truth that would follow Greece long after Persia withdrew. Unity achieved through fear and order carried its own consequences. Plataea ended a campaign. It did not end a method. The systems that enabled Spartan dominance would continue to shape Greek power, politics, and silence. What had been proven on that field could not be unproven. And Sparta would carry that proof forward, unchallenged, unquestioned, and incomplete. After Plataea, the field was cleared not only of bodies, but of ambiguity. Sparta did not remain to commemorate, it remained to account. Victory in Spartan doctrine triggered administration. Decisions had to be documented. Authority had to be reasserted. Allies had to be managed. What occurred after the fighting mattered as much as what occurred during it. Disorder after victory was still disorder. The Persian command structure had collapsed unevenly. Some units disintegrated under pressure. Others withdrew in fragments, retaining discipline but lacking coordination. Sparta treated each outcome differently. There was no singular response. The institution adapted its method based on resistance behavior, not moral judgment. This was not cruelty, it was governance. The Greek alliance expected redistribution, spoils, recognition, narrative control. Sparta delayed all three. Assemblies were postponed. Celebrations discouraged. The message was implicit. The war had ended, but authority had not shifted. Control required silence before speech. Records from this period describe Spartan commanders meeting in restricted councils. These were not debates, they were evaluations, which allies had held formation, which hesitated, which required oversight going forward. Plataea had revealed not only Persian weaknesses, but Greek ones. Information became leverage. Sparta understood that unity forged under threat would fracture once the threat vanished. The institution therefore repositioned itself not as liberator, but as stabilizer. Stability justified continued dominance without the need for open force. Persian withdrawal created a vacuum. Sparta moved to fill it indirectly. Rather than occupying territory broadly, it influenced decision points, command appointments, military protocols, alliance expectations. Authority was exercised through precedent, not proclamation. This minimized resistance while preserving hierarchy. Athens, in particular, was observed closely. Its naval power had proven essential. Its political culture, however, differed fundamentally from Spartan structure. Where Sparta centralized authority, Athens distributed it. Plataea had not resolved this contradiction. It had merely postponed its consequences. Spartan documentation from the aftermath avoids triumphalist language. Instead, it emphasizes containment. Persia had been expelled, but Persian methods, rule through scale, fear, and distance, were studied rather than dismissed. Sparta absorbed lessons selectively, integrating what could be controlled and rejecting what could not. This process reshaped the Spartan military institution. Training intensified. Command discipline tightened. Autonomy within ranks was reduced further. The system responded to success by narrowing tolerance for deviation. Victory reinforced rigidity. The fallen 300 were now institutionalized. Their story was no longer personal, it was procedural. Their sacrifice became a benchmark used to measure compliance. To question Spartan authority was to dishonor Thermopylae. This narrative mechanism proved effective. Opposition became morally suspect rather than strategically inconvenient, yet beneath this consolidation, pressure accumulated. Allied states began to recognize the cost of Spartan stability. Tribute was replaced with obligation. Protection with surveillance. Sparta did not extract wealth aggressively, but it extracted obedience consistently. Resistance, when it appeared, was subtle, delayed compliance, reduced enthusiasm, quiet alignment with alternative centers of power. Sparta tracked these shifts carefully. Control was maintained not through constant enforcement, but through readiness to enforce. The system did not overreact. Overreaction signaled insecurity. Instead, Sparta allowed discontent to exist within limits. It served as an indicator. When thresholds were approached, intervention followed precise, limited corrective. This approach mirrored Plataea itself. Wait, observe, compress, resolve. What outsiders perceived as restraint was, in fact, confidence in process. However, the documentation also reveals unease. Sparta had proven it could defeat an empire. It had not proven it could coexist with equals. The institutional logic that succeeded against Persia now faced internal contradiction when applied to fellow Greeks. The methods were the same. The context was not. Plataea had unified Greece temporarily. Its aftermath exposed the fragility of that unity. Sparta stood at the center, holding together a structure that required constant pressure to remain intact. Pressure always leaves marks. By the time formal peace with Persia was secured, the war's legacy had already shifted. It was no longer about foreign invasion. It was about internal alignment, about whose definition of order would prevail. Sparta believed the answer had been settled on the field. History would test that belief. When the armies withdrew, Plataea did not become a monument. It became an absence. No permanent Spartan markers were raised. No official narrative was carved into stone at the site itself. What mattered had already been absorbed into institutional memory. Sparta did not preserve history through display. It preserved it through silence and repetition. The campaign against Persia ended, but the method endured. The Spartan system emerged from Plataea reinforced, not expanded. There was no attempt to rule the Greek world openly. Authority functioned through alignment rather than occupation. Cities retained names, councils, traditions, but decision-making increasingly deferred to Spartan precedent. This form of dominance left little evidence. Orders were short. Envoys spoke rarely. Military presence was implied rather than constant. When intervention occurred, it was sudden and limited, followed by withdrawal. The pattern discouraged resistance without requiring permanent enforcement. Sparta had learned that visibility invited challenge. The 300 remained central to this quiet architecture of power. Their sacrifice was no longer debated. It was accepted as foundational. Over time, the story was simplified, stripped of context, reduced to principle, obedience, endurance, finality. These values were repeated in training, in councils, in judgments. What was removed from the story was doubt. Thermopylae became a fixed reference point. Plataea became its unspoken conclusion. Together, they formed a closed narrative loop, sacrifice validated by resolution. Questioning the outcome implied questioning the sacrifice. Few dared to do either. Yet beneath the institutional calm, erosion continued. Allies complied but did not integrate. Cooperation was functional, not ideological. Sparta demanded uniform behavior without offering shared identity. Over time, this created distance rather than cohesion. Records from later councils suggest awareness of this problem. There were discussions, not public, not decisive, about adaptability, about whether rigidity could sustain influence indefinitely. These discussions did not alter policy. The system had no mechanism for gradual change. It responded only to threat or failure. Plataea had produced neither. As generations passed, the memory of Persia faded. The structures built to oppose it remained. Institutions designed for external control increasingly faced inward. Surveillance replaced coordination. Discipline replaced trust. The method outlived its justification. In this environment, silence became dangerous. What had once unified Greece now divided it. Cities began to resist not Persian domination but Spartan oversight. The very restraint that once signaled confidence now appeared as detachment. Sparta remained calm. Calm had always been its strength, but calm without adaptation hardened into immobility. Later conflicts would expose this flaw, not suddenly, gradually, through miscalculations that no amount of discipline could correct, through opponents who studied Spartan methods as carefully as Sparta once studied Persia. Plataea was not forgotten. It was absorbed so completely that it could no longer be questioned. This was Sparta's legacy from that day, not merely the defeat of an empire, but the establishment of a system that believed resolution was permanent. History does not honor permanence. It records echoes. The field of Plataea returned to quiet. The armies moved on. The institutions remained. And the silence that followed spoke louder over time than any victory proclamation ever could. What Sparta struck down on that day did not return. What Sparta became did.